Hi, we are Security Overflow. Today we are going to talk about cracking the console. I'm Bingbing Huang.
I'm Bruno Castro-Karney.
I'm Andrew Tam.
Alright, so what is this issue we have? Basically, people want to run their own custom homebrew games on video game consoles that they own, but console makers don't because of the economics of the console market. Basically, when console makers sell consoles at such a low price, they have to take a profit loss. And so they make this up by having a single game store that requires developers to pay them a fee just to get their game released. So when users buy games, they have to get this from this game store so that the company that makes the console can make this money from the developers who pay to get it on the store. So securing consoles so that users have to get the games from the single store is really crucial for the companies to make a profit. So we're going to talk about the history of some hacks that have been happening on consoles, and then the current era, which has to do with the PS Vita, and a bunch of the legal implications. Alright, so we're going to talk about some of the early systems, which include the Sega Dreamcast, the PSP, and the Xbox. So the Dreamcast was one of the first consoles that had a big hack, and basically it came from them allowing you to run arbitrary CD-ROMs through this feature that they included so that in the future they could allow increased software support for various stuff. Basically, the BIOS would just check that the CD-ROM was in the specific format before booting it, and so people were able to reverse engineer the BIOS to create this sort of data that you could just prefix a CD-ROM with and then add anything you wanted after that, and then the BIOS would recognize it as valid and it would boot the disk. And so this sort of sunk the Sega business, and they just basically left the console market. So next to the PSP, one of the earliest hacks was just in the firmware. Someone was able to bypass the firmware to allow code that was not signed by Sony to be run. And so Sony really quickly patched this, but they did not enforce upgrading, so users could just still stick on this old firmware and continue running whatever code they wanted. Anyway, when they released a new version, they actually ended up forcing this upgrade, but then they introduced another bug, which is with the handling of TIFF images. So there was this buffer overflow, which allowed arbitrary code execution in this small buffer, which was like 64 kilobytes. So that wasn't enough to put a whole game in, so what people did was they used that code that they could fit in that buffer to downgrade the firmware to a lower version when they could then use the previous exploit to run whatever code they wanted. So Sony patched that again, and then there ended up buffer overflow in one of the games. So the games are called UMDs, Universal Media Disks, and in this Grand Theft Auto game, there's a buffer overflow that allowed arbitrary code to run, but the thing was the code was running with the permissions of the game itself, so it was in user mode, not kernel mode, so you had limited privileges. You couldn't do stuff like access Wi-Fi, but eventually someone was able to find an exploit in the kernel that allowed this transition, this escalation from user to kernel mode, and at this point homebrew games started getting really popular for PSPs, and so people created like development kits that let really anyone make their own games. So eventually Sony just kept upping their game. They started doing these sort of mean updates and making PSPs brick their system if they found suspicious hardware or firmware installed. And so people would do a lot of things like install mod chips to back up their firmware and try and get around this. But it was kind of nasty until someone came up with this crazy new thing called Pandora's Battery. And basically it could do a lot of cool stuff, and it worked by just putting the PSP into service mode, which is this backdoor that they included so that when they wanted to service and update a PSP, they could be sure that they would do it. And it just worked pretty simply. You just basically remove one of the connections between a circuit on the battery, and then it was in service mode, and you basically had complete control over the system. So for the Xbox, all this material comes from this really great book called Hacking the Xbox. This guy basically gives a comprehensive guide to reverse engineering using the Xbox as a case study. So the Xbox was the first console to have really desktop-like hardware, and so because of this, Microsoft took a really huge loss per console, like $200, which is as much as the console actually cost. And so, like, you could imagine just using this as a really cheap Linux box and running whatever code you wanted on it. And so Microsoft really didn't want that, so they needed a lot of security. Anyway, so the first layer comes from DVD9, which is just this dual layer format, which is a lot harder to burn than single layer. But really the important thing is that you had to make sure that the hardware was trusted, because if someone has control over the hardware, they can basically do anything that they want. And so the way the Xbox does it is just with this one little circuit on the board that basically computes a cryptographic hash of all of the other components before even booting to make sure that they're doing the right thing. And then also they would sign their games. So the idea was, when this guy was trying to hack the Xbox, is that if he could control the boot sequence, then he could end up loading whatever code he wanted onto the Xbox and then just bypass all of the other stuff. And so the boot code was encrypted with this a secret key, and so it was decrypted and then loaded into memory and then executed. And so you had to know the secret key to get the code that was being decrypted to execute in the right way. And so he was able to sniff the data that was passed along the system buses, and he logged all of that data, and then he was able to brute force the key by just taking like a sliding window of the data and using each of those pieces, trying a key and seeing if that worked for the cipher. And so eventually he found that, which allowed him to generate these ROM images that would then be correctly decrypted by the Xbox and then loaded into memory. So he could basically execute whatever code he wanted on the Xbox because he was able to encrypt it with the right key. And this was because the Xbox used this symmetric key cipher, RC4, which meant that they had to store the actual key in memory. So there was sort of a sticky legal battle that followed between fair use, intellectual property rights, but eventually this guy was able to publish the results. And so after this, a lot of exploits on the Xbox were now able to be discovered with the new information that was uncovered.
After about 6 years from release of their previous generations, companies are gradually rolling out the next generation of consoles to the public. Except for Sega stopped manufacturing any console, other companies including Microsoft, Sony, and Nintendo all released their new product. So comparing to former generations of game console, what have companies learned to improve security? In the old days, consoles often have exposed built-in backdoors for debug purposes, which could often be abused by hackers. And with messy permission management and almost no kernel permission, finding a kernel exploit which can take control of the whole system is pretty easy. Now, those debug functionalities are well encapsulated, permissions are getting more well-defined, and with kernel protection, the bar of hacking the system is significantly raised. Kernel mode exploits almost extinct, and user mode exploits are restricted. However, these new features are not sufficient to prevent consoles being hacked and run pirate games. If you look at the hackers' logs of almost all current consoles, they share one similarity, which is picking the built-in browser as an entry point. Is there any reason? The answer turns out yes. Specifically, they are focusing on the rendering engine called WebKit. WebKit is an open-source web browser engine, which is widely used by applications present on almost all popular PC and mobile platforms, and consoles are no exception. Therefore, usually a single exploit in WebKit can result in a remote code execution, regardless of what platforms they are running on. After years of security improvements, WebKit became relatively one of the most secure engines among web rendering engines. However, they are still far from perfect. Take Apple's WebKit variant as an example. It doesn't seem that bad if just looking at exploits by year. Except for a huge burst in 2010 and 2011, only about 5 to 10 exploits appears each year. So under the best case scenario, if software developers constantly update the engine, they should be pretty safe, right? If you look at the chart, the reality turns out that even that is not enough. If you look at the chart of exploits by type, you will notice that most of the exploits discovered falls into the categories we consider fatal. Denial of service, code execution, overflow, and memory corruptions takes more than 93% of the spots among all the discovered exploits. And the exploits trends over time also reveals that even for each year, these categories are always in majority. That's where things started to get scary. So what can these WebKit exploits bring to the hackers? To answer this question, I'm going to take PS Vita as an example. PS Vita is the portable game console developed by Sony and released in 2012. It was once considered the most secure console in the world because almost zero useful exploits were found during the first few years of its release. And it is not until last year that the first useful user mode exploit is discovered and make pirate games possible. The exploit is called Hankaku. The author provides a very specific explanation on how it works, and not surprisingly, the exploit comes from WebKit. The way to trigger the exploit is very easy. Just visit the Hankaku's website with Vita's browser, click the install button, and the Vita is hacked with all the basic toolkits injected into the system. How could they happen? First, it seems that there's a bug in the sort function in JavaScript. During sorting, toString is called for all elements in the array without any extra check. So if the hackers override to string to some methods that could create side effects, they are able to write things that want onto the heap. This is where the entry point of the exploit. After that, two exploits that discovered earlier were used, including the very first Vita WebKit exploits and the WebKit exploits found during Vita's firmware version 2.0 to 3.2. I'm not going to go into details about them, but what they can do is to let hackers be able to write arbitrary things onto the heap. And with a technique called heap spray, they can override text area of the system and lead to code execution.
Now I'm going to talk about the legal insecurity of game consoles. Although it is still considered illegal to jailbreaking video game consoles to run legally obtained homebrew software under DMCA, hacking groups show there are several reasons for jailbroken game console to be legal. First, hacking groups argue that console owners should be able to have more control over what software they can run on what hardware they legally own. Jailbreaking extends the device functionality. Consoles don't just have to be a game platform. They house within them a powerful computer, which can be easily and cheaply repurposed as a home media device or a general computing device. But repurposing the game console requires jailbreaking the system. Here are some examples of legitimate use of jailbreaking console, showing in the pictures. Educators using consoles as cheap TV-based PCs in classroom. Air Force researcher using 1700 daisy-chained PlayStation 3 as a cheap supercomputer. A jailbroken console allows for more basic personal uses, such as converting an Xbox to a home media center, where after its usefulness as a game machine is done. Moreover, they argue that jailbroken consoles can run illegal copies of copyrighted games shouldn't have any bearing on whether this legitimate use for jailbreaking are legal. Jailbroken consoles can be utilized to pirate games, but piracy is already a crime whether or not a pirate defends a technological protection measure over firmware. And pirates will continue to pirate games whether or not jailbreaking a console is legal. In the left image, a computer scientist at the Air Force Research Lab in Rome is surrounded by a high-speed image processing network of 1,700 PlayStation 3 systems linked to each other and other components. In the right, it is interface of a jailbroken PlayStation 3 with multiple illegal copies of games. So piracy always happens whether or not jailbroken consoles are legal. On the other side, the industry says the jailbreaking a console necessarily means eliminating built-in access control, increasing the incidence of piracy, and decreasing the incentive for publishers to create new copyrighted blocks for the systems. Accessing and distributing pirated content is a principal reason why users hack their video game consoles. The industry group showed numerous advertisements and online discussions seeking a jailbreaking console specifically for this purpose. There is abundant evidence that primary reason many users seek to hack video game consoles is not to create new and different works, but to avoid paying the customary cost of existing works or device, which can't have recognized as a commercial use. Absent these access controls, copyright owners would be legitimately concerned that their content could easily be infringed, and the incentive to make such content available through the video game consoles would be greatly diminished. Furthermore, the industry groups argue that the legitimate use case for jailbroken consoles are not compelling enough to justify a fair use. Being able to use consoles as low-cost computer is not a sufficient argument for an exception in a world where Moore's law reduces computer hardware costs quickly. As time goes by, the calculation per second per $100 go up rapidly, shown in this picture. Similarly, the group argues there are thousands of other devices that can already run Linux as an alternative operating system. Here is an Android phone running Kali Linux. Moreover, the inconvenience of not being able to run operating system of their choice isn't a significant burden on console owners. The main purpose of game consoles is for entertainment, not for being a personal computer. Therefore, it's still illegal to jailbreaking video games console to run legally obtained homeware software. Finally, the takeaway. First, there is no perfect console security in the world. As long as the user owns the hardware, they'll always be able to figure out a way to break it. Both console makers and lawmakers are collaborating to defend against console jailbreaking. Therefore, the cost of jailbreaking consoles will continue to rise in the future. That's all for our video. Thanks for watching. Hope you have a great summer. See you. Bye.